Well, technical difficulty. First time around doing this, there will be no video. No video for the first half. Them's the breaks when you're learning how to do stuff. This is kind of how it goes. So there's where we're at. Like I was saying, if you were listening to the podcast, this is hilarious and it's real and I'm posting all of it. So, this is really what happens. Anyway, so I started with a guy in Vermont. Within the 4 weeks, I thought I was going to use him. And I didn't because his co-packing plant closed. So that said, I had nothing else to do but to continue the search. And then I did find the co-packer that I'm currently using now. We had a long conversation about the process of how my mustard's made, and he was able to do it for me. So our very first inception, a new label. Now, not the one you're used to. This is the label before. This is what that looked like. So the previous one with the kind of bad run, that one was a clear label. And what this co-packer told me was, clear labels, the machines that are used to do the labeling don't really love a clear label, at least his didn't. So I listened. I said, okay, I could fix that. I could tweak it. I was still sourcing some of the ingredients for him, but that's the way it goes. So when I started with him, that's the jar, that's the label. So the jars are similar, the label's different, but super up to code. Everything is legit. I've legitimized here with this, and that was the first flavor in the first run with a co-packer. When I did my rebranding and I added a second flavor, I went back to him, and that's when Kiki changed. That's the same mustard. But the biggest thing is, as I'm showing this on the video, which I hope will air, the consistency. So this is, I would say, 95% identical to what I had been making in my home kitchen. So once I realized after that really awful first run that I couldn't be, well, that was, a bummer of a situation, but I knew I couldn't marry myself to the translation from this tiny, tiny batch to this big kettle mass production. It was never going to be 100%. But, the flavor has always been on point, and I think that's why people stayed with me even during that run that wasn't the best. So the second thing I would say is you need to, dependent upon what you're making, realize that it might not be 100% exactly what you're making. The goal would be, yes, that is it. And I think the more you dive into your network of what co-packers work for you, and the more that you speak with them, then you'll find that there is going to be someone who really does, hit the pitch for your product. And that's another thing I'll suggest, is that all co-packers are not created equal. Not only do they do different products, but you'll be working with very different people, very different styles. You need to find someone who, you don't have to be best friends and have coffee or dinner together, but what you do need to do is have a good rapport. You can't work with people you don't have a good rapport with. So really, don't just land on the first one that, it's the closest to me, or it's the first one I saw that does exactly what, keep looking and have at least, I would say, 5 options of people and talk to all 5 of them. That way you're going to be allowing yourself more bandwidth to see. So maybe you do work with the first one you talk to, but now if that doesn't work out, there's a couple other options. If you're doing this by yourself and you're not a huge conglomerate, anticipate what might go wrong. I did not anticipate what would go wrong with that very first attempt at a co-packer when I was actually doing it in the process myself. I was holding the jar, putting it under this filler, moving the jar and jarring it, and then putting it in a box. Now I don't do anything. I love it. It's like looking at Laverne and Shirley. I don't know if some of you know that reference to the show. And the jars just travel down the conveyor belt. They get filled. It's a whole process. They're sealed, so the seal has to pop. It's a whole different ball game. I have nothing to do with this except making sure the taste is right when I do create a new flavor. So at this point, it's automated in the fact that I would call the co-packer. I could say, hey, dude, I need a run of smoky peppers and a run of OG. Boom, done. I call my label people. They send the labels. Now, that's another thing. Your co-packer, depending on what your needs are, they source the jars. That means sourcing is they get them. So they get them, or I would have to get some of the product, like my chickpeas. I do not get from my co-packer. I get them from a different wholesaler. They fill the jar. They test the pH. They do all the testing on the food product itself, as well as they cook the recipe, my recipe. They put the lids on, the machine does, and they label them. They put the labels on. I have to order my labels, and that comes from a printer. They ship the labels from the printer to the co-packing facility, and then I schedule freight. So the freight truck goes out and picks up the pallets, and they deliver them to a warehouse locally here that I use to store my mustard, and then distribution happens. But that's a story for another podcast. So you have to also see when you're talking to these co-packers initially is what steps. They might have a system that they use for shipping. There's 100 different steps. Another question I got was, I'm going to take everything that I make and I'm going to send it off to a co-packer. Don't do that. I'm not saying start super small, but put your toe in the water. If you've never played in the game like I didn't, you don't want to go down the same road that I did. I'm hoping that this helps you avoid that. You want to go down the path of sort of a really definitely dive in. I don't want you guys to hinder yourself from moving forward, but I really think you need to do so with some, a little bit of research behind it. That would be the best way and the smartest way to do that. So I would pick a product or two and then start going through the list, start picking out a set of 5 to 10, co-packers, start talking to each one of them, and then move forward from there. I don't think diving in and just picking the first one and having no idea. I think coming at that, if you've never done packaged food before and you're thinking I'm just going to make my grandmother's recipe, it's going to be great, I'm going to move it, it doesn't really, it does and it doesn't really work like that. Granted, I think you need to take a minute to say what's your process? What is the recipe? You need to make it, and then you need to write it down. And because it can't be just a toss of this and a toss of that and a toss of this, you have to really write it down, make the recipe yourself, or I guess someone else if you're partnering with someone. And then after you've done that, then you start talking to co-packers. The other big deal, make sure you sign an NDA, non-disclosure agreement. This makes it a little bit harder for them to steal your recipe. You don't want that to happen. The non-disclosure agreement kind of prevents that. So it's your recipe is your recipe. You are giving it to them, but you've both signed, and that way they can look at the recipe to see how they have to scale it for production. That's just part of it, but make sure you're signing that NDA. Big deal. It's a big deal. I think you need to cover your ass, period, in any kind of business dealing. So you want to make sure of that. Another thing is the last question I'll cover here real quick and finish up for you guys is cost. So cost is hard for me to come out and give you a number. It's hard for me to say, it costs $50 to do a mustard run. The cost is different because you have to look at the whole scale of the cost, because that's how you're going to determine your price point of your product. It's not just what you have to pay the co-packer to make and jar your product. If you're just looking at that cost, it's actually really lower than you'd anticipate. It's still a hearty sum, but it's lower than you would anticipate. It's under $10,000. Let's put it that way. But co-packers are different, and so do product making, so I can't speak to all that. the cost of your product is not based just on that moment where there is a team of people in a factory making it and doing your product and you paying for that. The cost also goes to the freight and how much it costs to ship it to you, how much the label costs, how much the sourced food that you had to get from a wholesaler that your co-packer didn't have, how much did that cost? That is how you determine what the price is. So it's not just that moment of like, oh my God, this is great. Like they're going to make it for X amount of dollars and that's it. You have to really look at other costs. Now, I had someone else create the label for me, and then I had a printer print the label for me. I do not have those skill sets. I could not have done it any other way. That's part of it. Now, if you are a genius graphic designer and also know how to make hundreds of thousands of labels and have the facility to do so, you're cutting your cost right there. And that's something that you want to look at is you want to try to see how you can limit the cost. Of course, the more that you purchase of labels, like the if you purchased 100 as opposed to 1,500, well, it's going to be cheaper to get 1,500 than it will of 100. Those are things that you want to look at. And the first time out, it might be, wow, crap. Like I really spent, the first time I made mustard, it was, for me, cost was $7 a jar just for me to make it. I was not winning. People were happy, which was, part of it. But, to call that a business at that point, I couldn't have because it was so costly just to make the jar. So 1 jar of mustard, that's what the cost would be. So thankfully, I've been able to get that cost down. I'm hoping to get it down lower so that would, help me and help you all that love it so much to lower that cost. But So, I mean, if I just to reiterate and go back through, decide what products out of your business you want to send to a co-packer. Don't send all of them. If you're just coming off the starting block and you are like, I really want to make food and I love my grandmother's sauce, Nona sauce, or gravy, depending on how Italian you are. Great. Well, you need to sit down with Nona or yourself and get a list of those ingredients because you can't show up at a co-packer and be like, yeah, just can you do this? Like they need it. It's very specific. You could tweak it as you go, but in that first initial handoff NDA signing, they need to see a recipe. So you need to get a recipe together. Go through the list, find 5 to 10 co-packers, talk to all of them, see who you have a rapport with. You don't, again, have to be best friends, but if you're going to work with them, you don't want them to be a jerk, or maybe they think you're a jerk. So either way. After that, you need to find out what ingredients you need to source. So you have to look up wholesalers of food, which are pretty easy to find. And then you have to figure out your packaging, and that's, again, in the conversation realm with what does the co-packer do? What do they offer you? So that's a long, lengthy conversation. And I think that's it. And then cost is going to be determined upon like all the moving pieces that go in there. It is definitely a bigger undertaking, I think, than some people realize, but it's worth it for sure. I also would have really appreciated someone having made a podcast like this before I started. So I'm always here to help you guys. If you have any questions, please just send me a smoke signal, email, text message, whatever, DM. I'm really happy to chat. For those of you who inspired me because you did reach out, thank you for reaching out and inspiring this. I hope I'm helping other people. And if I missed the mark, just let me know and I could help you fill in the blanks of any other questions you guys had. I really appreciate you tuning in for this interesting half-recorded Kiki's Life Over Brunch podcast. If you guys liked it, share it. Share it with a friend that might be interested in the food packing or they have a food product they'd like to package. And that's it. I'll see you guys soon. And until then, stay flustered.